Good morning and welcome to Stan Canada's Spring Town Hall. Today we have a bunch of very important issues on our agenda, including several bylaw issues that involve changes to Stan Canada's membership rules, the way that we elect board of directors, and issues related to our finances, and also our potential partnership in whatever form that may take with Aegis International. In addition, we're starting off with some updates on our focus regions from our policy team led by Christina Warner. And afterward, we'll take questions. So it's extremely important for this particular town hall that we conduct a vote according to what our bylaws require on these major issues. So there will be an opportunity for everyone to speak and participate in questions and comments afterward. If you have anything that you want to speak about urgently, you're welcome to use the chat feature, and I will be moderating as we go. And if there's a good place for us to pause and address any questions that comes up, I will do that. And if not, we'll wait until the end of every agenda item. Furthermore, I believe that there will be a survey sent out to all the members regarding the issues that have to be up for a vote. So Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think probably given the numbers that we have today, it'll be best if we just do the official vote through that format, and we'll discuss the issues now. And if anyone wants to bring up anything that would affect the language of how we would phrase the questions up for voting, then that would be very highly appreciated. So thank you very much for attending this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Christina for the focus region updates.
Hi everyone. I'm just going to give, wow, that is a beautiful slide that I'm just seeing my face on. Thanks for that, Adi.
Google your name with Stan Canada.
That looks like it might be my LinkedIn photo.
It is.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll just give a really brief update on the priority policy recommendations for the 4 focus regions we have, which includes Sudan, South Sudan, Myanmar, or Burma, as well as Iraq and Syria. The way that the policy team is set up is that Andrew, our deputy director, has the primary supervision over the Sudan and South Sudan teams. So unless he joins immediately, then I'll just read the upcoming policy recommendations as they stand, because I just want to be accurate as to where they are, since he's not with us to provide that update. And then for the Iraq and Syria and Myanmar, Burma pieces, I will go ahead and offer those. So I'll start with Iraq and Syria and Myanmar and Burma. In Iraq and Syria, the focus has been on long-term development, making sure that humanitarian aid is able to access, and that Canada is able to be a part of brokering peace agreements between local tribal places and local tribes, And in the midst of that, we've been focusing on the domestic pieces of that. So for refugees who've been fleeing the wars in Iraq and Syria, that they would be welcomed into Canada and provided with the support that they need to set up here in the country. And that especially includes not having to pay back the Canadian government for a loan on any of the transportation fees associated with their coming over into Canada. Recently, we were pretty successful in that the Canadian government did, after pressure, eliminate any interests on the debts that were related to immigration loan programs. So that's a huge success, and it means that there won't be an increasing debt for those individuals above their principal. However, the Canadian government still intends to charge refugees the principal balance of those loans. So we're still working on that, and we want to make sure that that is something that is abolished and made into a grant program altogether, so that refugees aren't responsible to repay those funds to the Canadian government. So that's the focus for Iraq and Syria. We have been paying attention to the bombings and the use of chemical weapons in Eastern Ghouta. That's been more recent, but we don't yet have policy recommendations related to that in particular. For Myanmar and Burma, as you all probably know, it's a really quickly unfolding crisis with the refugees from Rakhine State and also those who are internally displaced in Rakhine State moving into Bangladesh. That includes environmental degradation that puts a significant amount of refugees at risk in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh as they wait for flooding. And as Bangladesh plans to shift all of those refugees onto an island that regularly floods, and they're building up the island in hopes that it would be a place where that these refugees would be able to settle. which is kind of a recipe for disaster. So looking at the concerns of refugees, including health and the care of women and children, making sure that they have trauma care, things of that sort, and humanitarian aid, as well as making sure that there is access to investigation in Rakhine State, making sure that we're able to record the atrocities against Rohingya communities, and watching as these sites of genocide and mass atrocities really are covered over, bulldozed over sometimes making sure that the military installments that we understand are being built on top of Rohingya communities are recorded, and that we're able to make sure that what happened in Rakhine State recently is something that is known publicly, because there still isn't much access. So advocating for access into that state is a big piece of it. We've also been looking at the sanctions that the Canadian government places on individual Burmese leaders to make sure that those are targeted towards people who are responsible, to have an impact and pressure those individuals to reduce the atrocities being committed against Rohingya communities. So caring for refugees and also caring for those people inside, and also looking at what a possible return situation would be if those circumstances were to come up. So for the Sudan and South Sudan pieces, I'm going to take a look at the documents that we have on our updated policy recommendation sheets. So for South Sudan, the policy recommendations are that the Canadian government pressure President Salva Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar to abide by ceasefire agreements, that the Canadian government collaborate with the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is an 8-country African trade bloc, to help reinforce or enforce ceasefire agreements in order to make that happen, and to pressure Sudan and Uganda to end their involvement in the conflict. Second is to make sure the Canadian government uses appropriate diplomatic channels to ensure that the UN and its partner agencies are able to effectively operate and provide the delivery of food, medication, and shelter to those local populations. Third is to make sure that Canada chooses one of the following areas of development to better streamline and management the development process. So to focus its aid in one of these particular areas. The first is general security, the second, food security, third, healthcare, fourth, education, and fifth, democratization. Our fourth policy recommendation is that Canada should work with local South Sudanese groups and humanitarian organizations like the UN or the International Rescue Committee and others to encourage reconciliation between the Nuer and the Dinka peoples. And fifth, as the Canadian government has recently announced that it is considering sending peacekeepers to Africa, to consider deploying a substantial peacekeeper presence in South Sudan in order to strengthen the UNMISS mission in that country. For Sudan, our recommendations are that the Canadian government should foster dialogue and coordination with international partners to arrest responsible leaders and bring them to trial before the ICC. Second is that the Canadian government should dispatch observers and researchers to Sudan to ensure that democratic processes are being respected with regard to electoral reform and accountability, loosening of government control over the media, individual freedom of expression and rights to peaceful assembly, as well as other related civil liberties. The third recommendation is that Canada continue to support demobilization, disarmament, or rehabilitation, DDR, shorthand for those three actions and activities, and reestablish a strong presence in the region, specifically through the threat of reduced bilateral trade, working with Sudanese government to facilitate dialogue between opposing factions, working to foster dialogue that would suggest assistance in reducing Sudan's foreign debt, and coordinate support through UNAMID Community Stabilization Section, CSS, efforts to retrain and reintegrate ex-combatants into the Darfur society. Fourth recommendation is that the Canadian government should create a subcommittee for the prevention of genocide and crimes against humanity, which should be attached to the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. This would allow Parliament to monitor, to keep MPs informed about the onset of genocide and crimes against humanity, including the identifiable stages of these crimes, to look at prevention, become proactive in its response to such crises, allowing MPs to act early and utilize a wider set of policy mechanisms, and then coordination as well, centralize Canada's institutional approach to the issues of mass atrocities by giving one central committee a mandate to comprehensively monitor, study, and recommend courses of action. So that's where we're at. I'm happy to answer questions. Like I said, I'll be more prepared to answer questions on Iraq and Syria or Myanmar and Burma than I am Sudan or South Sudan, but I'm happy to take those.
We'll take a quick pause here for questions. If you think of anything later, again, you're welcome to write it down and share it with us in the chat box, or to me personally. You can specify who you want to send chats to. Scott, are you raising your hand or are you touching your phone?
I'm touching my phone, sorry.
Great. So we'll be moving on. Just to emphasize again, something that was in the description for the meeting, that if you have any particular, excuse me, other conflicts that you would like to refer to the Advocacy Steering Committee for review or to the policy team, this is a really good time to do that. So if something's on your mind and you have a question related to one of our specific focus regions or others, please go ahead and bring that up today. Christina, I actually do have a question though. Which regions are currently, or which conflicts are currently on the watch list as it stands?
The watch list has been, can you say a bit more about what you're referring to as watch list?
Is that we haven't adopted as a focus region, but we're kind of monitoring.
Sure. Yeah, so Burundi and the Central African Republic are still those pieces, and the DRC was one for some time, but we aren't, we pay attention to that when it comes up into the news, but we don't have anyone focused on media updates or anything like that for those regions.
Great. Okay, so we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. So this is Scott is going to talk for a little bit of time about the bylaws and the Aegis Amalgamation. Please do try to pay attention a little bit to what's going on. Scott, you tried to make it as clear and simple as you possibly can, right? All right, you're still on mute.
Yes, definitely.
Great.
All right, so basically my presentation is basically giving background on what bylaws are generally and why they're coming up now. And then next, I'm going to go into the actual details of what's being voted on. That being said, I chose to pull out the sections of the bylaw that's most relevant to volunteers and chapter members. Tori, feel free to go to the next slide. So it's after that point where we're going to have questions. When it comes to number 3 on the agenda, votes, I believe, Idi, you said we're going to save that till after, and that'll be just over email, correct?
Yeah, I think we should we'll put together a little quick Google form that'll be really simple and it'll lay out all the facts from the presentation.
Sounds good to me, yeah. So before we move on, there's going to be opportunity for questions. So if there's anything that I didn't address in my presentation that you wanted to ask about that's actually in the bylaw text, that would be the time to do it. So next we'll flip to background. And I guess the slide after. So, did that get cut off? Oh, okay, good. So I wanted to start with a bedrock on what exactly bylaws are. So they're essentially the main rules that any organization has. So not so much to do with, say, with us political advocacy, it's just more so internal stuff on how we actually run ourselves as an organization. So any group that is incorporated with a federal or provincial government is required to have some form of bylaws. Some are more comprehensive than others, depending on their particular circumstance. So, as it says in the bullets, they're primarily dealing with legal and financial stuff, as well as setting internal disputes, voting, and the like. So, there's generally 2 levels of bylaws that require a vote. So the more run-of-the-mill kind of stuff, that's just more housekeeping, is the simple majority vote, 50% plus 1. But if it's anything substantial, such as the definition of a member, that does actually require 2/3 majority, depending on the section. So in the bylaws that we have before us, I made sure to actually note which ones do require 2/3 vote. And some of these cases, or actually, yeah, all of these cases, anything that requires 2/3 majority vote is actually required by the federal government itself. Next slide.
Scott, maybe we can pause for 1 second. Christina brought up good points that I think would actually be useful to address right now. If we're going to be doing the online vote, how will we know when we reach a quorum? I'm thinking that the filling out of the survey could be the means by which people renew their membership with STAN this year. And
that works. Yeah.
So then, to be clear to the people in this meeting, you have to fill out the form in order to be a STAN member for 2018, 2019.
Yeah. And directors also need to vote, I should also mention. Otherwise, we definitely won't have quorum. Okay. So anyway, on this slide, it's basically just every rule document that we have to follow. So obviously the federal law, the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, there's no changing that. That basically came into force for us in 2014. And basically any of the documents below it, so 2, 3, 4, if there's any contradiction between that and the act, that's obviously like out of order and isn't actually in effect. The articles of incorporation, it's generally basics stuff such as how many people, minimum and maximum, are allowed on a board, what province our registered office is in, which provinces we operate in. That's generally, we try to keep any details out of there because, as the bullet says, it costs a lot of money to change. Bylaws, which we're voting on, it will always require a vote to change. So in general meetings, town halls like these. And then operational policy, that's specifically just to do with the Board of Trustees. So it's primarily going to be dealing with money things. So like what amounts of money we're able to spend between board meetings, what needs to be approved by the board explicitly, that kind of stuff. So if there's any contradiction between the bylaws and operational policy, the bylaws will rule. Next slide. So the reason why we need to do this is because the law says so. So the vast majority of not-for-profits actually did a top-to-bottom review of their bylaws in late 2014. We, as STAN, took care of the higher-level stuff with articles of incorporation at that time, but because of how much time and just brain power is required to actually deal with the top-to-bottom review, we have been a little bit slow with it. But we finally managed to do it, and it is, I admit, related to the potential amalgamation with the Aegis Trust, which is my next presentation. So basically the intent is to get our housekeeping in order so that we're in a better position to amalgamate with another organization in general. So next we'll go into the actual sections of the bylaw. So a lot of this stuff is because the law requires us to. So generally, we've only kept like a segmented membership list, but we never really had anything for like chapter members. So this is something that we're going to be transitioning to over the summer. So central membership list, but I want to emphasize this has nothing at all to do with the ability to volunteer for STAN. It only applies to actually having a vote, such as what we're going to be doing with this proposal in the first place. So everything, like all memberships, will need to be renewed April 30th of each year, starting next year. So keep in mind that these bylaws that would have these rules come into effect May 1st. So we made sure to take care of any contradictions between the current set from 2009 and what we're voting on today. And I made sure to also include a section on putting the onus on directors. Anyone that reports to a director, the onus will be on that particular director. to tell volunteers about the fact that they have to apply, well, opt in for membership in order to vote. And generally, I don't anticipate much of a problem with that. Next slide. So next, basically, we have to be reporting on our money situations. So, oh, I believe, yeah, that's it, Tori. So we have to produce financial statements to members, but I just want to distinguish the fact that financial statements don't necessarily need to go through an audit. So basically, it's reporting what we have in terms of assets and liabilities and the like, and our expenses through the year in various categories. But when it comes to having an actual audit where we have an auditor go through our stuff, that costs more than $1,000 to do that annually. So what we'll need to do is, well, the plan is to release our unaudited financial statements a good time in advance after our financial year ends, and basically give everyone enough time to review it and to answer any questions, because the federal law does does require a unanimous vote to actually sidestep the audit requirements. So we're trying to balance the fact that it costs a lot with the fact that we do owe it to members to report on our financial situation. And next slide. Let's see. So there are going to be opportunities for an election. So this would be people that sit on our board of trustees. So this would be higher than the current director's team. These people would be responsible for financial and legal responsibility. And in practice, they're going to be having a large role for fundraising and grant applications. So the director's team will be responsible for like the day-to-day operations, and then the board will be responsible for making sure that we're following the law and making sure that everything is sound with our money. So in this current proposal, we have 2 trustees to represent chapters and volunteers. So basically, chapter members and volunteers will be voting for the same pool of candidates. And we have it as 4-year terms, but I do want to emphasize that there's no expectation to do all 4 years. The reason why we chose to do this way as opposed to like once every year is just to minimize the amount of procedure that we have to do, so that if someone wants to serve 2 years, for example, we don't have to have a re-election. We only have the re-election when that particular person resigns. And that's, yeah, right, thank you. Review of relevant sections, means procedure. So in the current set of bylaws, we have 14 days notice. In the new set, it's going to be 21 days, so 2 weeks to 3 weeks. There's an explicit section or 2 on allowing proxy and absentee voting, and basically the rules are spelled out for both of those. So proxy voting is basically where someone is voting, let me rephrase that, someone that is participating in the meeting has the ability to vote on behalf of someone else. Absentee voting is where you're voting over email in advance of a meeting. And the reason why we're going to have it so that ties that end in a vote will not pass is essentially because historically as an organization, we've always tried to get to some form of consensus. So anything that's controversial, where we actually do need to take a recorded vote, anything that is anything close to tie is not really something that we really carry out. We generally try to do something more than that, where it is at least 2/3 in practice. So Another way of phrasing it, though, with any votes that end in a tie will not pass, is essentially 50% plus one, where it is more than a tie. And I think that's it for the review. If you have any questions based on what I said or what you read in the bylaw documents, feel free to ask them now.
So a lot of these issues have been up for debate with the directors team for months, and we've been discussing them in some depth over like Google Docs and in the meetings. So if you have any concerns about the way that any of this would work out in practice, please raise the issues.
Yeah.
I think
Also, Tori, you can probably go to the next slide just to see what the actual motion is, the legal motion is. Yeah. So that's basically what everyone's going to be voting yes or no on.
So in the survey, we'll do like a bullet point of like, these are the things that would change in the bylaws, just to make it super clear again.
Yeah.
And we'll put the deadline for, should we do it for April 30th then? And give people time to.
Sorry, I didn't catch the sentence. Do it for
April 30th. We can do the deadline to give people enough time to reach out to us for questions if they need. I'm wondering about the April 30th membership expiration anyway.
Yeah, that only comes into effect, May 1st.
Okay, so then maybe we can do something like April 22nd deadline, so we can bring up any issues to the directors team at that meeting, and then we have another week to make any adjustments as needed.
I like that.
Okay, so we're going to send out this email hopefully today, and everyone will have 2 weeks to fill it out. Sounds good?
Yeah. So as this is a special resolution, 2/3 majority are needed to pass.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're rewriting it. Okay. Eddie, I guess we're talking about Aegis next.
Yes, so the Aegis issue is something I'm noticing, like we only have one member here who hasn't been in all these directors meetings, Laura. Laura,
Hi,
which
Laura.
team are you from? Hello, Laura.
Sorry, guys, I'm on my phone and it's not cooperating very well. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah. Crystal clear.
Okay.
Which team are you from?
I'm part of the communications team.
Okay, great. So just so you're aware, Aegis International is an organization that has been working with the other stands, Stand USA, Stand France, and Stand UK. Scott will do a little introduction about them, and we're considering the possibility that we might put together some sort of partnership with them. So, Scott, you can take it away.
Yep. All right, so let's go to the next slide, Tori. Thank you. So basically what I have here is generally the internal discussions that we've had over the last few years on just the general idea on being taken over by a larger organization. It is primarily because we really want to delegate the legal responsibility to another larger group. So whereas us as volunteers and directors take care of the day-to-day and advocating for our cause, we have another organization that actually has the accounting and legal resources to make sure that everything is okay on that side. That was one of the main things. And then the other thing is potentially having access to a larger budget and resources. So not only are we talking about money in itself, but also access to existing staff. So, and sorry, as I lost my place on my own screen. Yeah, go ahead to the next slide, Tori. So Aegis Trust is a British-based organization, roughly 17 years old, and it was actually founded in response to genocide in Rwanda. So they have actually been doing quite a lot of work in reconciliation in the country. And if you ever happen to go to the country, you will actually notice that everyone that works there is wearing Aegis logos, because they actually run the country's genocide memorials. So by and large, the organization's main administrative operations are in London, but most of their programming is actually in Rwanda itself. So this is also the parent organization of Stand USA. So although USA and Canada stands have always been independent from each other, I believe Aegis is Stand USA's second parent organization. Before 2015, it was, I believe, an organization called Resolve. I don't know much about them, but it is my understanding actually that for very little of Stand USA's history, that they've been fully independent in a similar way as Stand Canada has always been since 2005. So because of the partnership with Aegis, where USA essentially delegated their legal and financial responsibility to Aegis, that actually did lead to a partnership where, excuse me, where Aegis's campus chapters essentially officially folded and turned into Stand chapters. And just in the past academic year, there has actually been Stand France. I'm not sure how big they are, but they do receive staff support from one staff member that Stand USA has. So that particular individual is responsible for supporting supporting all three stands. And it is from my understanding that if Stand Canada was to join Aegis, that position would also be responsible for supporting Stand Canada. So we'll go on to the next slide, because that's kind of tied to everything. So from the operational side of things, which is most relevant to volunteers and chapter members, there'll be some expectation on collaboration on campaigns. It's just more so, not necessarily exploring, but whenever there's an intersection between what we're working on as Stand Canada and what other stands are working on, there's going to be some expectation of collaboration in whatever form. Obviously, we all have different audiences, so there may be varying levels of cooperation on that front. Now, when it comes to the board level, though, there's going to be greater coordination on particularly grant applications for actually getting us money. So there will be some action on the European side so that they actually have a European staff member, and thus there'll be more resources for the US staff member to support Canada. But also, we're also going to be trying to fundraise for any kind of salary dollars on our end. Probably wouldn't expect full-time in the near future, but part-time student positions, that's a possibility. Then the second main bullet there, because a corporation is not, well, not necessarily a corporation, but an organization is not allowed to own a not-for-profit organization in Canadian not-for-profit law, Aegis will have to have a majority on the Stand Canada board. And related to that, because we'd have to change our seat allocation on our board of trustees, that does also mean that everything would need to come up for a vote again to Stand membership, because we'd be amending our bylaws. And then this last one on your screen is probably the most sensitive and the thing that requires the most thought from everyone involved. This will require an expansion of our mandates. So from the beginnings of our history as an organization, we have focused particularly on genocide and not mass atrocities. But all the other stands do have genocide and mass atrocities in their mandate. So Tori, go to the next screen. I have a side-by-side comparison, and it may not all completely fit on your screen, I realize. So basically, for those on the phone, I'll read out our Canadian mission statement and then the mission statement for USA, UK, and France. So for us, it's Stand Canada advocates making, preventing, and ending genocide a cornerstone of foreign and domestic policy. We provide Canadians with education and advocacy tools to take action toward a world without genocide. The other STAND mission statement is STAND is the student-led movement to end mass atrocities. At its core, our mission is to empower individuals and communities with the tools to prevent and end genocide. From our innovative leadership team to our network of thoughtful and change-oriented student activists, we are mobilizing campuses and communities across the country to act against genocide and mass atrocities worldwide. So it has been said to us that we don't need to take the other STAND mandate word for word, but when it comes to having genocide and mass atrocities, that's something that they've been trying to impress upon us. So at the director's level, we've had quite a spirited discussion about this, and very thoughtful discussion about this. And it's not necessarily when it comes to efficacy, but when it comes to rigor that our director's team has been really hesitating about. Essentially, as students, as youth, we primarily have to defer to more authoritative sources where we cannot be the ones that do the research, particularly primary research. For us, it's only secondary research from organizations that have established themselves in our field. So whether it be organizations that we would rely upon to determine whether or not a particular conflict is within our mandate, all the way to our policy recommendations, what to be focusing on in the first place. It is guided by our membership, yes, but it is also relying upon established organizations for the actual establishment of facts. So when we expand from genocide to mass atrocities, things get a lot more fuzzy because we're not necessarily sure on what it's more difficult to draw the line on what is within our mandate and what is not within our mandate, and things do stand to get a lot more muddled. That's been the general position that we've agreed upon in our own directors meetings. So I think Adi would be able to speak to this a lot more thoughtfully than I just did, to be honest. But this is the kind of thing that we're grappling with. So this is not necessarily breaking a deal breaker, excuse me, when it comes to amalgamation with Aegis, but it is something that they do want to think, or they want us to think about it very thoughtfully and come to a decision on it. They actually want us to make a decision on it. So that's basically where things are at now. There was supposed to be a trustee meeting where Stand Canada was supposed to be on the agenda for, the trustees of Aegis Trust. We didn't quite make it onto the agenda for this quarter, so it's going to be the next quarter where we go on to their finance committee and thus to the trustees as a whole. So when it comes to any kind of actions on our end or Aegis's end, we still do have quite a bit of time to flesh things out, both on the legal side as well as when it comes to our mandates and mission statements. And that's basically all that I have for this presentation. So yeah, next slide, I suppose. So does anyone have any questions, comments at this point?
So I'm curious as to what people think about how we should go forward with this, because as Scott mentioned, the issue of the mission statement has very far-reaching consequences for how we operate as an organization and what we consider within the scope of our mandate. I'm interested in what people would think about how it is best to approach our membership about going forward with this or not going forward with this, or in what way to go forward with this. So if anybody has thoughts about that, that they'd like to share. So maybe what we can end up doing in the end is once we have reached a little bit more of a concrete idea of where we're at with Aegis, because we know a little bit of where we're coming from our side, but we haven't necessarily gotten an agreement with them, as far as I understand, right, Scott?
That's correct.
Yeah. So once things are a little bit more concrete, I think what we should do is hold another town hall meeting, advertise it widely again, and try to get as many volunteers as possible involved in that discussion, and potentially like also distribute a survey of some kind also, just to make sure that everybody's okay with this. But it is true that at this point in the discussion, volunteers have the most opportunity to actually influence the direction of this kind of like negotiation as it goes on. So I'm interested in how we might be able to engage people more substantially in the lead up rather than in the decision, the final decision.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to clock this meeting under the hour.
I have a feeling that when it comes to this kind of discussion, that like all of Stan's leadership will need to engage directly with their teams, and then when it comes to our chapter's engagement team, raise it during their meetings with chapters, like individually.
Yeah, well, we're already up at the end of the academic year for chapters, so that'll be an interesting challenge going forward. I'll make sure to bring that up with the chapters team. But I think that you're right. Maybe we should think about this as a team-based kind of activity, and then the directors can bring forward the team comments into directors meetings, and we'll have the final thing.
Yeah, because when it comes to the timing of amalgamation, there hasn't been much discussion, but I just know that it's going to be a lot more painful if we do any kind of like legal amalgamation mid-year as opposed to like taking effect May 1st, 2019, for example.
Right.
So I think we still have, we have plenty of time to like discuss this thoroughly.
Okay. Then what I would like to recommend to the group here, and that we have a bunch of directors present, is there any recommendation? Are there any recommendations that the other directors have about how the executive or whoever ends up working on this, what kind of tools can be provided to the team? What kind of information can be provided to each team to facilitate this discussion within those teams? I think we're all fairly familiar with the issue right now, right? Good. I'm just scrolling to see all nodding heads. People okay.
I think the only thing new is the side-by-side comparison of the mandates.
Okay. All right, so we'll continue to discuss that going forward. I guess we'll end the meeting here. So thanks everybody for your participation, and hold on one second. Thanks everyone for participating. We will be sending out the survey today, right, Scott? We can do it?
I think it's quite doable, yeah.
Awesome. And if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out by email to your director. And we'll be sending out the recording of this meeting with the survey also. Sounds good?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye.